sorry about that. That's the reason why Spain was the one that laid claim to these enormous swaths of territory, and that was rather common. You wanted to have a experienced sailors and captains at the helm in order to get have your expeditions be successful. By the Again, it was Dutch merchants that were primarily funding these efforts, such as Henry Hudson's, and establishing Dutch settlements in the New World. So it was much in line with what England was pursuing, and that goes to figure with what you learned from Niall Ferguson and his several part series looking at kind of the more economic history and development, and the establishment of companies like the Dutch East India Company. It was those individuals, those investors, that could pool their money, their resources, in order to fund these types of expeditions. By the 1620s, private investors had established settlements and trading posts in what is today Delaware, Connecticut, and New York. And this was not only in places like what is today New York City, but it was be also upriver, up the Hudson River, as far as Albany, what is today Albany, New York, as well. In 1626, Dutch merchants bought the entirety of what is today Manhattan Island, spanning some 22,000 acres, for about $24 worth of trading goods. So, and of course, this is some of the most valuable real estate in the world today. What's important to note here is how cheap the cost of land was because it was so abundant. I mean, the land in Europe, while it is rather vast, it was already well, uh, you know, predetermined as far as who was going to be owning the land, how much, when, and where, and how that was going to be passed on from generation to generation. So if you were a part of the landed class in Europe, you would continue to enjoy a portion or a parcel of property. Um, if you were not part of the landed class in Europe, then you really had very little, if any, hope of becoming a landowner. This was also an attractive prospect for those that wanted to make the treacherous voyage across the Atlantic to, try their luck at becoming a member of the landed class, and in doing so, by moving to the New World colonies. So there were a number of motives here for trying to, um, you know, expand the population of these colonies, attract fresh settlers, and make sure that there was a commercial success, and that these communities could thrive. By 1640, the trading company um, allowed settlers to trade freely with the Indians, with the Native Americans. Um, Wealthy speculators released their monopoly on the trading posts and trading rights themselves. Previously, settlers could only sell their goods, of course, to the trading company. Again, that mercantilist like policy was in effect. This was done to attract additional settlers. That if you uh, allow for the expansion of trade, if you allow the settled population to conduct a larger degree of free trade with whoever's interested in buying or exchanging goods, this would mean that settlers would be more likely to move to the New World, take a chance at kind of starting a new life for themselves. And what's also interesting to note about the Dutch experiment in these colonies, specifically in the New World, is that they were particularly what we'd say today is rather forward thinking. Women could conduct business, enter into contracts on their own. They could own businesses in their own name. They didn't need a male sponsor as they did under English law. Um, they could sign and engage in contractual business in their own right. So, in that sense, it was very kind of promising for women in the Dutch settlements in particular. Now, to kind of offer a little bit of a spoiler, when you have these colonial wars that are going to take place between the powers in Europe, um, because these communities begin to bump up once against each other, English and Dutch and French, among others, that they're going to either help feed into conflicts between the European powers jockeying for greater resources or what have you, or it's going to the conflicts between these established monarchies are going to basically be responding to local conflicts in the New World. That would be the case between the Dutch and the English, roughly during this period of time, the 17th century. As these areas get sorted out, as the English consolidate control along the eastern seaboard, and as Dutch settlers come under English rule, that means that they're going to be subject to English law, which means that women who were able to conduct business in their own right, those rights would be stripped away once they fell under the influence of English law. So there would be this kind of sliding scale, you might say, of freedom, liberty for certain populations. So, and roughly kind of dovetailing with this, because there were Dutch communities in close proximity to English communities, there was a competition between them to attract, again, settlers. This is before they really largely fell under the influence of the English. And so, therefore, you needed to come up with ways to try and attract settlers. What's one way to do that? Well, to say, look, we'll begin to relax the policies of kind of a mercantilist oriented economic model, because we know that that's not particularly beneficial to local colonists trying to establish themselves in the New World and eke out a living. And so that's why the Dutch, kind of began to try and come up with more creative ways to expand avenues for trading. The trading companies also provided settlers with tax exempt status for as much as 8 years, so that they could, again, use any profit that they got from the sale of what they were offering, the resources they were able to acquire. They could use the entirety of that profit to buy land, to buy more land, to begin to really kind of get their homesteads, their farms primarily, because we are talking about agricultural communities by and large, try and get these up and running, so they could get established. With regard to Native Americans, there was a concerted effort to establish valuable trading ties and, with that, allies, primarily in the New England area with the Iroquois. This kept a relatively peaceful threshold with them, something that the English admired because, again, we're talking about the Dutch being more successful at establishing kind of diplomatic relations with the native population. The English, not so much, and the English would, once they began to consolidate control with along the eastern seaboard, and once the Native Americans realized that they're not really dealing with the Dutch settlers, but they're having to deal with the English kind of law and English authority in the colonies. The English would try to maintain that kind of goodwill as best they could, with, I mean, to be honest, varying degrees of success. In England, to turn attention back to Europe here for a brief moment, you have from in the early 1640s a civil war that begins to erupt. This is largely as a result of taxation and religious, again, this idea of religious stratification, primarily, again, between Catholics and Protestants. As a background, King Charles I, governing or reigning from 1625 to 1649, was the son of King James I. It was King Charles that was going to try to begin to encroach on parliamentary power. So, which is another aspect, another dimension, really, of the power play within England itself, between the monarch on the one hand and the parliament on the other. By 1628, Parliament had began responding to this power creep by King Charles. They passed what's known as the Petition of Right. This made it so the king could not raise taxes without Parliament's consent, which is only going to fuel animosity between the monarchy and the Parliament, as you might expect. Charles was looking to obviously exercise greater political power here. It didn't help matters that Charles was married to a French Catholic, and wanted to exert, as a result, Charles wanted to exert greater control over religious practices in England. This was seen as a sign by the Protestants as Charles wanting to acquire Pope-like authority over the Church of England, the Anglican Church. So there were opponents to the king's policies that were rather outspoken. They were quickly rounded up. They were tried before courts that were under the king's control, and they were punished physically for their perceived treason. This would include whippings, branding, physical mutilations such as the cutting off of ears or the splitting of noses, of nostrils. By 1640, the Scots began to rise up in Scotland against this type of religious regulation and, in their eyes, religious oppression. Charles, needing to raise an army, needed to raise the money to fund the raising of an army, which meant he needed to raise taxes in order to put down this rebellion. This meant that Parliament had to be called into session so that he could have their their blessing in doing so. Parliament had not been called into session for over a decade. And when Parliament refused to consent to the raising of taxes because they took issue with the king's attempted tyranny, in 1642, Charles I is going to respond by taking his soldiers and invading Parliament and arresting those who opposed him. So this is the King Charles I, basically stripping the parliamentary body of its effectiveness, its authority. This act in 1642 is going to ignite the English Civil War. And again, it's important to understand here that this is roughly overlapping with the period of the 30 Years' War taking place on the continent. Because of what was happening in England, because of all this jockeying for power, from King James I through King Charles I, that they're going to be so preoccupied with keeping their own house in order that England would remain neutral by and large in the 30 Years' War. It's a Catholic monarch governing over a predominantly Protestant citizenry. So that's volatile enough as it is, without being involved in the broader 30 Years' War conflict. So in 1642, Charles invades Parliament, rounds up the heads of parliamentary order, those that opposed him, and arrest them. Cavaliers, as they were known, remained loyal to the king. Roundheads, as they were termed, were loyal to Parliament. The Roundheads, those parliamentarians, were led by Oliver Cromwell. He organized what's called the New Model Army, and in 1645 this New Model Army was successful, victorious over the Cavaliers. King Charles I was beheaded, I believe, and the monarchical rule would not return to England until 1660. When that happened, and so Oliver Cromwell is in part he's going to lead the country towards this kind of commonwealth-like existence that is without a monarch, essentially. In 1660, there's going to be the restoration of the monarchy. This would occur with the installing of King Charles II on the throne. He would govern from 1660. He would reign from 1660 to 1685, and in 1663, shortly after he's able to consolidate control over England, 8 of the king's closest political allies were given control of all the land between Virginia and Spanish-held Florida in the in the mid-Atlantic region of the New World. This was a reward for their loyalty and service to helping get the king put back on the throne of England. These political allies divvied up that large swath of land. They established representative assemblies in those areas, like they had done in like Maryland had done decades earlier. And free men were given absolute authority over Negro slaves according to the terms, the charters that were laid out for those colonies that would arise there. These 8 kind of lords were doled out 150-acre lots to interested families and settlers that could, afford or had the capability to manage those kind of sprawling types of estates, or what would become known as plantations. And that's important to understand because for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, 150-acre plots meant that there was going to be kind of a predetermined, again, landed kind of class in the southern colonies, and we're talking about North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, and also, in contrast to that, in New England, the land there, though it was used for agricultural purposes, was not very conducive to large, sprawling farms like of the variety that you see being established in the Carolinas and in Georgia after 1663. That's largely as a result of the soil, the land itself is very kind of rocky in the New England region. There's a shorter growing season, so that you have to till smaller portions of land in order to make sure that you're maximizing the harvest, getting the harvest in on time before it goes to waste in the fields. In the South, where it's a bit of a different climate, semi-tropical in some areas, then you're going to begin to be able to keep track of and begin to maximize larger swaths of land and manage it more effectively. So this is going to reinforce the idea and the practice of keeping land in the hands of a few, which is going to help feed into this idea of an American aristocracy being founded primarily in the southern colonies, which is going to lead to different styles of social structure, where you have kind of a smaller, more egalitarian type of societies being established in New England based on notions of rough notions maybe of equality. In the South, you're having kind of a more formal aristocratic kind of social structure being followed or installed, really. And that's of course important to understand as we continue looking at what's happening with the development of colonial society that is going to later transition into American society once the independence is won and the United States is formed. So you can see here in this lecture that England's colonies are developing and had developed for several different reasons. Commercial profit, as in the case of Virginia, religious freedom, as in the case of the Pilgrims and the Puritans in New England, and also as payment for political loyalties, like we just saw in the Carolinas and Georgia after 1663. In the middle colonies, places like New York, Connecticut, New Jersey, and Maryland, there are going to be early examples of multinational interests that were at stake in the region, Dutch interests, as examined at length, began to compete with English interests, and that there's going to be this competitive effort to entice settlers to, you know, go with settling in these one of these options that were available. So this would be, again, through the extension of tax-free incentives or the benefit of more liberal trade practices. All right, so that gets us to the end of this lecture. Again, moving forward, we'll be looking at the developments taking place in colonial society, looking at how difficult it was for colonists to set themselves up, get things running, and moving from there, we will look at the more focused view of mercantilist systems and also the slave trade in the middle colonies, and by that point we should be getting into we'll then focus attention on Europe, as I said at the outside of the first part of the lecture. Kind of beginning to gravitate to other regions of the world, so that we're following roughly the same, bringing each region up to date as far as the time frame that we're studying. So appreciate your patience, and look forward to next time as we move forward with the lectures. Take care.